What is discernment counseling? Should you do it? And does it make sense to do it if you already know that you want a divorce? I'm going to unpack each of these questions for you today because discernment counseling is a very, very useful tool when you're navigating significant challenges in a relationship, as well as when you're navigating the whole process of separation and divorce. So let me start with a little bit of history on how discernment counseling came to be. And I like to start explaining this by saying that there's an assumption that's made in couples counseling. And that assumption is that both individuals are interested and willing to work on improving the relationship. So, figuring out what the problem is in the relationship, figuring out what they can do to improve it, and then applying themselves to make some of those positive changes. And that's called leaning in. So, leaning in is when you're interested in improving the relationship and making it better. And now couples counseling starts to break down for both the couples as well as the therapist and become really frustrating when one spouse or the other is quote unquote leaning out. Or in other words, they're no longer interested or willing to work on the relationship. So now suddenly it feels like this individual is getting pulled into couples counseling and doesn't really want to be there or doesn't want to talk about things or make behavioral changes outside of the therapy sessions. And so that, like I said, is really frustrating for everyone involved. So a couples therapist by the name of Bill Doherty recognized that this was a challenging dynamic and it called for something different. So if couples counseling is what you typically do when both individuals are leaning in, he came up with discernment counseling, which is what you do when one of the individuals is leaning out. And to compare and contrast the two, couples counseling is oftentimes open-ended. It's intended to go on for several months as long as you're making progress with the goal of improving the quality of your relationship. Discernment counseling is very, very different. It is a defined process, never more than 5 sessions, and it's really designed to do just 3 things. And included in that list is not to repair or to improve the relationship. The first of those 3 things is to identify the marital problem. Identify the problem in the marriage. And so this is typically done, the therapist or the discernment counselor will meet with both individuals and they'll have an opportunity to articulate to the other person what they perceive or what they are experiencing as the most significant challenge in the relationship. Oftentimes, doing discernment counseling allows for a new degree of honesty and vulnerability that may not have been accessed in couples counseling. So I oftentimes will say, this is the Hail Mary pass, or this is the last stop on the train, right? You either say it now or you don't say it really ever. And so just knowing that discernment counseling is that last stop on the train oftentimes will get people to say some things that they may have had a hard time saying in couples counseling. And now the second thing that discernment counseling aims to do is to help both individuals to see how they have some shared responsibility in the marital problem. And so this starts to break down and get away from a victim perpetrator role setup where if one person would just change, if one person would just do things differently, then suddenly the relationship would be fine. It's never that simple. And so discernment counseling is this process of both people striving to take some accountability for the problems that have been acknowledged. And now the third and the final step in discernment counseling is to make a decision on where you go from here. And there are 3 paths. There is status quo, where you end discernment counseling and you just continue to be in the relationship the way that it is. Path 2 is divorce, and there's a commitment to move towards divorce because either, one partner may be unwilling or unable to work on the relationship or to make the changes that are being requested, or potentially one individual simply not engaging with the discernment process. And then the third path that things might go is that now that the two of you have been even more honest about the issues in the relationship, and you've both discussed how you can take some responsibility for the issues in the relationship, are you willing to take the prospect of divorce off the table so that it's no longer a threat and no longer something that's being actively talked about? and then commit to 6 more months of couples counseling to see where that gets you. And so that's discernment counseling in a nutshell. And I want to talk about 2 use cases where this is really helpful. The first is when you've gone through couples counseling and you've decided to end couples counseling, but the problems remain. Because now the question is oftentimes, what comes next? And it's oftentimes unclear where we go from here. And so shifting from couples counseling into discernment can be very, very helpful because, again, no longer are you focused on the relationship and how you're both behaving in the relationship. You're just getting clear on whether there's a shared appetite to even continue to work on the relationship. And this can be a bridge into more pointed discussions around separation and divorce. Or, like I said earlier, it may unearth something new that didn't come up in couples counseling that will allow you now to move forward. The second use case is less obvious, and it's one that I talk to a lot of clients about, which is using discernment counseling as a tool when you know or are pretty darn certain that you want a divorce, but you have some concern that your spouse is going to be really surprised or shocked or go off the rails when you bring up the D word. And so I find that when one individual is emotionally ready to start the divorce process, they're thinking attorneys, mediators, how do we start talking about the ins and the outs of getting separated? And yet, if the D word has never been uttered and divorce has never been an actual discussion between the two of you, this is a cart before the horse type of situation. Because I can tell you right now that trying to work through a separation agreement with someone who doesn't know why they're getting divorced, doesn't know what happened, doesn't know what they could have done differently, is tremendously difficult and difficult for both of you. So there's oftentimes an opportunity here to recognize that, yes, you may have decided for yourself that you want to move in the direction of divorce, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your spouse is ready to engage in that process with you. And so that whole conversation of like, how do you tell your spouse that you want a divorce is really challenging. And discernment counseling can be a tool that fits into that space to help you to do that. Because by recommending that you do discernment counseling, you're basically indicating that divorce is an option, or it's a possibility, or it's on the table, because that's why people ultimately end up going to discernment counseling. And then over the course, again, of oftentimes 1 to 3 sessions, I don't see it go all the way to 5 that often, you will get into some pretty raw conversations, again, about the issues in the relationship and then your relative contributions to those issues. And this can really help that other partner to see your pain or to see the problem through your eyes, and an opportunity for you to also see, are they willing to meet me in the middle? Because oftentimes that's part of what's driving someone's desire to divorce is they feel like they've made some appeals or some requests or tried to set some boundaries with their partner, and all of that's been either ignored or the compliance with it has been somewhat spotty. And so discernment counseling can create a little bit of a buffer between what you're feeling right now and the actual challenging process of splitting up your finances or talking about custody and parenting of the kids, and give the other spouse an opportunity to catch up. Because I find that when two people enter the divorce process knowing and being able to recognize and kind of describe what the problem was in the relationship, and also seeing what their role and contribution in that was, and then kind of knowing for themselves whether they were willing or able to engage with what needed to be done to save the relationship. If they've decided that they're not going to do that work anymore, then they've kind of accepted that divorce is going to happen. So my hope is that this has been helpful. Oftentimes people will get a recommendation, whether it's from a therapist or a friend, to look into discernment counseling. And the first thought might be, but if I want to leave the relationship, why would I continue to do something with a therapist? And hopefully this video has helped you to see that there are reasons for doing discernment counseling beyond working to improve and to save the relationship.